Chapter 52 Into the Mist. The mist had grown thicker around her ankles, like a decaying fog. It reeked of dust and ancient tombs and ruins by the sea, the darkest and oldest places of the earth. When she glanced over her shoulder, a faint path remained where her dress had swept through the mist. She knew not how long she had been walking, for the voices called her onward and nothing else now mattered. She needed no light, nor any parchment inked with runes. The whispers were her guide. When they grew distant she retraced her steps, and when she reached an impasse, she found another path. Occasionally her trance was disturbed by the scraping, skittering claws of tiny rodents scurrying along the stony walls, but they kept to the shadows and Kentucky kept to the road. Soft lights overhead emitted faint currents of energy, illuminating a maze of cobwebs in the drafty hall. Kentucky brushed these aside, trailing spider silk and insect wings. They bothered her no more than the touch of moonlight, or weeds beneath the water. The leggy web weavers scuttled into the darkness, and she hummed a few notes to warn away the ones that cursed her in their tiny insect voices, brandishing their fangs. Once she would have banded songs with them. Today they were a hindrance, for they stood between her and that which she desired. At length, the echoes led her to a cold, dark hall. Within the hall, a broad stone arch, and, set in the arch, a great door comprised mostly of petrified wood. Those voices swirled in the air around her. A whimpering, muttering, chattering cacophony of delicious noise. And then a flickering magic rose above the chaos. Kentucky halted, listening intently, as a glimmer of starlight broke through the shadows. It came and went too quickly to ascertain its nature, but then a faint ripple passed through the hall. Not a living song so much as the broken reverberation of a song which once was. Flash. A glowing shard of light hovered in the air for an instant, like a blown spark from a campfire, before snuffing out. Her lip curled as she recognized the presence from the Hall of Statues, that nameless entity which had haunted her since. Before she could dart past, 2 more sparks appeared, and then 3. As they brightened, a familiar face took shape against the darkness of the hall. It was a human figure, tall and austere, with the piercing eyes of a mortal and the soft features of a woman. She had glimpsed it before, several times now, though the spectre always vanished when Ember turned to look. Hissing, Kentucky fumbled backward. If it was a spell, it was unlike any spell she had yet encountered, and how could she weave a counterspell to that which she did not know? The mortal face furrowed with a deep, dignified sorrow, or rage. Kentucky shrank away. It was only a fragment of magic, a song which was quietly unraveling even as the figment stood before her. No more real than a shadow upon the wall. Yet the fair-haired woman lifted her hand, a message clear enough without words. Go no further. Kentucky observed this for another moment, shivering and twitching her ears as the voices beckoned her from beyond the door. At last, she reached out a hand of her own. It passed through the visage without harm, and she curled her fingers around the latch. The woman's hair swayed as she drifted forward, frowning sharply. For a moment a bare foot flashed into view, as if from beneath an invisible dress, and then it was gone. Her golden visage sputtered, face contorting as many expressions splashed across her fragmented countenance, wide angry eyes, a grimace which might have been a trick of the vanishing fractals, and an unsettling sorrow. Each glimmer of magic winked out like stars before the rising sun. With a sigh, she vanished as silently as she had come. Only a few blown sparks and a whispering echo remained, and as the remnants faded into the ether, a breath-like presence touched Kentucky's senses. Soft, golden, and broken, like the vision herself. If man-magic it was a delicate and beautiful sort, the arts of which were long forgotten by both Ember's kind and her own. Never before had it attempted to communicate with her in any meaningful way. A warning. Or perhaps she was only jealous. Yes, perhaps she was guarding this place. Instinct and probability told Kentucky that if this entity had the power to harm her in any way, she would have done so long before now. Why she hadn't was a curious mystery which might have distracted her once, but there was no time to consider it. The door was before her. The voices beckoned. She tried the latch at once, shaking in anticipation, but the door was barred from the inside. Perhaps Ember would be able to. No. Must not think of him. To Kentucky's inexpert eyes, it appeared to have been a storeroom of some sort, or maybe a place where those men who had made the wine and harvested the honey had once lived and slept. When she crouched down and put her face against the rough cobbled stones, she could almost see beneath the door. Something glimmered within. Kentucky rose to her feet and stamped them impatiently, sniffing and twitching. The whispers heightened, pulling at every fiber of her being until she thought they should tear her to pieces, and yet she could not leave. In truth, she wished it would never end, and if she were to be torn asunder it would be such a thrilling experience that perhaps she would not mind after all. It would expose the innermost parts of her being to those beautiful echoes. The harmony of Ember's ancestors. Muttering words of obtainment under her breath, Kentucky brushed some of the dust from her skirts and examined the handle, trying to put the ghostly woman's face from her mind. It was bolted from the inside, but the latch was rusted in one place and particular felt weaker than the rest. She whispered to the metal, wiggling the door back and forth as it seemed necessary. After several moments of this quiet game, her hapless opponent let out a relenting creak. Kentucky took a shallow breath, and lifted the latch. The door swung inward, and the clamoring voices hushed. Broken metal dusted the floor with a sound like shattered ice as Kentucky slipped into the cavernous chamber. A breath of cold chilled her damp face, calling forth the depths of a distant ocean, and the rolling mist of the rocky shores after nightfall. A sense of weariness thickened the air, muffling the echoes. She still sensed within them that delightful melancholy which shivered her bones whenever Ember looked at her directly. When, for a fleeting moment, she could almost envision the rhythm and flow of energies which surged beneath his flesh. The tantalizing glimmer shrank, fading from view. Kentucky slunk across the stone on all fours and widened her eyes to take in more light. She was well used to traversing the gloomy crags and valleys of the coast, but this cold, creeping darkness pulled at the edges of her vision. A faint plinking came from one corner of the room, where water dripped unseen from above. Her hand strayed upon something unpleasant. She hissed again, pulling away from the stickiness, and spread her fingers. Dark ooze webbed between her claws. The texture was unlike that of her snail skin, more like the tarry sap of a diseased shrub, and the sulphurous stench reminded Kentucky of a rotten egg Sel had once offered her for a trick and a laugh. Loath to soil her skirts, she wiped her fingers upon the stone floor instead, but the further she crept, the more of the black sludge she encountered. No matter, for at last a subtle glow appeared. She put out a hand as the ethereal echoes intensified. Tink. Kentucky blinked. Glass. A pair of glimmering black eyes reflected in a crystalline surface, and her own siren beauty distracted her from the cloudy light. She curled her cold fingers around a beveled jar. As the wavering luminescence rose and fell, so her heart thumped with it, thick and heavy and dripping with desire. Her breath fogged the glass as she hummed. She wished to attain that exquisite melody, for their inlay perfection, and for the first time in all her memories, Kentucky's song fell short. Irritation tugged at her upper lip, threatening a snarl. At first the light had appeared as a crackling ember, and now many embers which coalesced into a tongue of green flame, shrinking and elongating as if it drew breath. This was not the wild magic of the forested foothills, with its feral sentence. No, this whispering light, it shaped itself. It was its own master. A sweet harmony, like soft chimes, pressed upon her consciousness. Kentucky softened her mind as best she could, pressing her trembling fingers against the glass. But though she would have welcomed the foreign contact, there was no audible word, no thought nor joining of any kind between their minds. The echo she held was the uncloaked essence, the soul, of a human woman. Entirely bared before her, naked as one of the forest wisps below the mountain stronghold. Hers. Hers at last. It had always been hers, ever since the elder had regaled her with his beautiful, nonsensical stories. Why else would it be here, if she were not meant to have it? She had thought at first to take a little piece of Ember's truest self someday, as much as would never be missed, if she could only uncover the artifice of the elders, secrets now surely lost to dust and decay. And yet here was better a thing by far. The light flitted to and fro as Kentucky brushed away a layer of dust and grime, yanking impatiently at the cork. The jar had been tightly sealed. Before she could take a breath to sing, the stone floor trembled. She sprang to her feet, scraping her knees in haste, and clasped the jar against her chest. Smoky mist blew away from the walls, trailing through her oily hair and ruffling the hem of her dress. Scores of recessed shelves became suddenly visible, home to a multitude of clay pots, stone vessels, and an assortment of other jars. Myriad spirit beings flickered within the translucent receptacles, their songs murmuring and fretting as the mist seeped into the darkest alcove. There, it drew itself up to the height of a very great man. Kentucky stumbled back, and then staggered sideways, cowed by a powerful instinct to flee yet rooted to the stone by the enveloping presence of 100 human souls. The mist compressed into a black, impenetrable fog. From it rumbled a sonorous groan. Gra. Gruhhmmm. Mmarrrgghhh. Into the mist Part 2. Two eyes, or something akin to eyes, blinked to life within the sleepy mass of shadows, and Kentucky could not help but stare wildly back at them. A nebulous body took shape in the looming darkness, yet the eyes themselves appeared to float at will through the mist, tethered to nothing at all. Graham. That. Ice's mine. Words. Shockingly high and hollow like branches creaking in a windstorm. They had no apparent source, but came from everywhere at once. Kentucky clenched the jar fiercely. It is mine now, she hissed in the siren tongue. Grr. The fiery eyes burned brighter and the misty swirl slowed. Ah. I know your kind. You are not a mon. Kentucky recoiled, unsettled by its knowledgeable stare. For a moment the two of them appraised one another, silent in the dark. She crouched lightly on the tips of her toes, poised to dart away, yet still caught between the beautiful echoes and the freedom beyond the door. I will be taking this away, she crooned very softly, for I am meant to be having of it, and you will be glad of this. You are offering it to me freely, as a gift. Clever tongue, gasped the entity. Riven souls. Ever did of clever tongues. The mist whirled toward her in an eddying wave. Kentucky squeaked, stepping back and tightening her grasp, but her fingers closed around empty air. Blackness writhed across the floor, darkening its winding path, and when it lifted the jar had reappeared exactly where she first found it. A fresh streak of sticky darkness sullied the glass. HRRMM. That is mine. And you are not welcome, Riven Soul. A chill skittered across Kentucky's neck. Riven Soul. Rumors and illusions pricked at her memory, though nothing fully manifested. At last she managed faintly, oh, being of such terrible beauty and darkness, by what name are men calling you? If this apparition continued to trade words with her, she could linger a while longer in the presence of those echoing essences. Somehow, some way, she would convince it to part with one of them. She would, because she must. GRRMH, it rumbled, and the eyes shifted slightly, as if their focus had returned to her. There are none who remain to call upon me. And none who would dare if they did. I am older than the seas, and older than the skies. And wiser by far than your riven kind. Begone. The burning eyes faded as a sulphurous sigh gusted past, ruffling the hem of her dress. All lights dimmed beneath its long-suffering breath, but the echoes still cried out to her, confused and despairing and sublime. Through the delirium, Kentucky reasoned that even an eldritch entity was no different to most corporeal creatures in being susceptible to flattery. She swallowed, vaguely aware that she had begun to salivate. You must be skilled in your weavings, older than the seas and older than the skies, Kentucky lulled, clasping her hands and swaying in place, for the elders of my clan are strong, and yet even in their strength and splendor, they cannot sing the life from mortal veins. The apparition chortled. Grum, gr. Your methods. CRRRRRUDE. Your kindred. Weak. You sup the mortal blood in vain. Never tasting the fullness of humanity. Riven shall never know the pleasures I have known. For I share not my SSSSSUSTENANCE with inferior beings. Kentucky would have taken sharp offense had she not been otherwise occupied by her observation of the captive souls. The more intently she hearkened to their disconsolate whimpering, the more confident she became that to claim one would be a sort of kindness in itself. One or more of them must be in want of a body after so many years in isolation. Was it not possible they had tempted her here, desirous of what she could offer? Surely they wished to be free once more, as surely as she wished to be fulfilled, and would such an agreement not be a sort of freedom for them both? She risked a step closer. How are you keeping a soul to these vessels? Clever Riven has shaped magic before, yes? Such intricate beings require something to bind with, else they should have fled my SSSSWET affections long ago. GRRRRRRMMM. Kentucky shivered with a primal dread, dredged up by the otherness, the nearness of this thing. But she, too, was clever. Syl had always been the better at coaxing others into submission, but Kentucky had succeeded, once, though she rotted to this day. There must be a way to bespell her foe, though it was doubtless ill-advised to attempt such a beguilement when it was not mortal, and had no mind to bend. Perhaps Ember's fanciful goblin tales were not so fanciful after all. She could not even begin to guess at what else it could be. If Ember were here, he would. Ember must not come here, she reminded herself, wiping a bit of frothing drool from her chin. Ember must not find this place, for he should wish to free them. And we have not claimed what is ours, yet. Once the soul was in her possession, she would hunger no more. The fortunate mortal she chose would be restored to a body, in most respects a comely one, certainly more alluring than whatever mortal figure it had fled so long ago, and Ember need be none the wiser. Kentucky was already wondering what sort of mutually satisfactory arrangement might be made betwixt two incorporeal beings sharing the same corporeal form when the misty figure spoke again. Ah, glorious day! Day of death! Much grief, much tasty fear. My bonds are loosed, graha, much torn flesh, innumerable souls dripping from their mortal cages. And we gathered them all. To hoard them, CARESSSSSS them. To feast on their, I already am knowing this story, Kentucky cried, digging her fists into the knot of hunger. It was difficult to remain upright, for she now felt far emptier than ever before. Speak no more to me of feasting. The lights all shrank, their voices hushing. Grum. The eyes floated closer. They fear you. Kentucky curled her fingers beneath her sternum, stifling the ache. These mortals were freed from their cages by the Riven. 'Tis the Riven I have to thank for my feast. I merely claimed what they could not. Even now, they are muttering to me. They call you many names. Poison tongue. Devilfish. Deep dweller. SSSSSNAIL skin. There was no magic in the words, and yet they struck Kentucky a grievous blow beneath the breast, piercing her heart as surely as the tooth of a spear. What means you by this? She whined, stricken. She knew of this, in part. It should not strike her thusly. Strange. That your kind have already forgotten. What fell force succored them, when this mountain crumbled into ash? To reply in any manner was to betray her ignorance. Her beloved elder had never once woven words of a pact with demon folk. It stood to reason that the soul snatcher must be speaking falsely, or perhaps her clan knew less of the ancients than they fancied. The thought was discomforting. I slumbered, bound in the darkness. For an age beneath the ocean, sighed the snatch, and a stray tendril unfurled to fondle one of its shivering souls. The CURSSSSSED kings of the olden days. Ah, they banished us. Their magic was bright, too bright for our eyes. The pain. We hungered in vain. And then, the Riven came. A huffing, gusting sigh wafted through the room, and with it the stench of sulfur and soot. They came with promises, and they came with. Kentucky squeezed her eyes shut and pressed her palms over the whole of her face, certain that somehow this nameless horror could see beyond her fingers, beyond her lashes, and into her riven soul. Demands. Chapter 53. Where Darkness Lies. I beg of you, she groaned in piteous envy, tell me only how you are doing this. I care not for the rest. Tell me that, and I will leave this place. A frantic sort of despair settled into Kentucky's heart as she spoke, for the coldest sinews of her being knew why she longed to obtain this information, and the part of her which resented it was crushed beneath her lust. What is possible for one such as I, riven soul, is impossible for you. I suffered many long years to master this art, it whispered, with a note of pleasure. Yet even that sounded hollow to Kentucky's ears, as if it were only the imitation of pleasure, to bridge the vast divide between her meager understanding and the dark and ancient understanding of this entity. I was not so different from the riven, once. We aligned our purposes. But they broke faith with us. They sought what you seek, and in their desperation, they were foolsss. Eyes closed, crawling, reaching, Kentucky felt her way toward the wall of human relics as the snatch continued muttering and wheezing. To itself, she thought. Fools. Yes, fools, all. I, the last. I, the wisest. I, remain. Are these souls not binding to bone and flesh, once? Kentucky gulped, throat tightening. Can you not bind one to my bone and flesh? One of its eyes burned brighter in the mist, hovering closer than was comfortable. The hunger blanketed her desire, fear, and guilt, muffling all thought apart from vague notions of how she must have it, of how she would obtain it, of how she could not live without it. As I remain inevitable, so it seems the darkling riven remain unenlightened malcontents. Saliva dripped from the corners of her mouth and spattered the floor. She shifted her bare foot, brushing the cool glass with her toes, and swallowed harder. I'm not like those who are coming here, before. I should be content with such a little piece. Her hand twitched toward the mist. Grr. The jar disappeared with a scrape. Away with your slippery fingers, riven, if you have nothing of value to trade. I'll think of something, she mused, her voice hoarse and her lips numb. What will you offer me? The snatch hissed viciously. What succor can a cracked vessel beg from a wellspring? What might a useless, quivering wretch, a descendant of failures, offer the one which remains? A cold draught washed over her and she trembled, ears shivering. A spell song. The throaty laugh which answered crushed Kentucky's pride. You will sing for me? I could be making you to feel anything you wish, she said as stoutly as she could manage, lifting her chin. I shall weave for you a dream of bliss, which will surely endure until forever's end. Grrhm. Mortal panderings hold no pleasure for one as old as I, it burbled. You have seen that I am not so easily enchanted as mankind. I will require something far more valuable than a simple siren song. Kentucky pondered this, quailing at the implications. Be still, riven soul, and we shall see. If you bring anything useful to me. Thin tentacles of mist crept across the stone as it encircled her with its tendrilless fingers, huffed its foul breath which was not a breath upon her skin, and in all ways encompassed her until at last Kentucky felt that she, too, must surely be devoured, yet she could not pull away, nor turn aside. Feelings floated to the front of her mind, unbidden. Memories she had long buried, dredged up like the mud and silt at the bottom of a stagnant pond. The confusion turned to muted horror as she understood that she had not called them forth of her own volition. The soul snatch quickly pulled those particular fragments of herself, the uncertainty, the fear, the whispering doubt, into the immense fold of its nothingness, as effortlessly as one with physical form might inhale a pleasant scent or a refreshing breeze. Worst of all, there was no chanting nor magical persuasion, its confidence, omnipresence, otherness bled into her mind as the moments of her insignificant existence flitted past, wringing old emotions from every thread of her being. Her tongue shaped words without her consent. Why can I not have a taste? The voice sprang forth from her breast, but higher and more tremulous than her current resonance, and a pair of blurry hands reached out before her. As her vision focused, she saw that they were her own, but smaller with stubby little claws. The hands of a child. Blood trickled across jagged stone, dyeing the ocean darker with each washing wave. Syl crouched beside the body, her beautiful face stained berry red, eyes wide with their ever-manifest annoyance. Because our elders have not declared you worthy. They are cruel, Kentucky sighed miserably, tucking her chin to her knees and watching the blood run into the sea. She stared into the empty eyes of a man who had been smiling only a breath ago, and wondered what he would think of his ending, if he were still alive. Familiar sadness twisted her insides. At first it had been sadness for herself, but now all things were colored by the presence of a being which would never breathe again. Kentucky leaned closer to touch his still, pale face with her dark fingers. "Someday I will be worthy, sister. I will be like you." A bony hand smacked her arm away and Kentucky cried out in pain, recoiling. The smoldering fury in Sil's eyes frightened her. "You will never be like me. Speak such another lie, and I swear to you upon my locks that you shall never speak again." The snatch lost interest, sweeping past as the flash of pain in her wrist turned to incoherent wailing. Kentucky gnashed her teeth. The memory rushed past with a fury, growing louder in her ears as the current swept her along. Enchanting notes of laughter drifted through the whispering trees as Kentucky stalked her sister's footsteps. She peered out now and then at the red-haired Serena and her 3 crooning friends from behind scant shrubs and thickets which hedged a lonely deer trail. The song of the ocean rushed nearby, calling her back to the friendly tide pools. Kentucky was uncertain of finding her way alone. She always managed to lose herself in these pines without Sil there to guide her. Now she was beginning to thirst in hunger, but she dared not reveal herself. It was far too late for that. Her sister would be angry. Desperation clawed at Kentucky's mind. Why had she followed them here? Why had she not lingered to gather shells in the cove, as Sil had instructed her to do? A twig snapped. She gasped quietly, ducking behind a graceful poplar as cold fingers gripped her wrist. Kentucky looked up into her elder sister's familiar mask of calm distaste. The scent of bitter pine and sage blooms overwhelmed her, comforting and dreadful. "Were you spying?" Kentucky gave no answer. None was necessary. "Do you know what we do with spies in our clan, sister?" There was no getting away from her bruising grasp, and it would be worse if she ran. Sil leaned forward until their noses touched, and her lower eyelids creased into a smile. "We hang them." She tried to wrench herself free from the memory, but the snatch rumbled in pleasure as her world tilted upside down. Kentucky screamed. Vines bit her ankles as she cried after her sister's retreating form, compelling her to return, even as Sil hushed her with a word of silence. How was she to know that her childish fear of isolation would be the end of her? Now Kentucky rocked herself back and forth, swinging wildly and struggling to curl her weak body upward to grasp the bonds at her feet. Though she thrashed until her ankles were tattered and weeping, her fingertips barely brushed the surface of the murky pond. Again and again she lunged for the cool, still waters. Yearning, hoping. The sun set. Her pounding heart began to slow. Her sniffling breaths grew fainter, and her head throbbed. Night breezes cracked her delicate skin. "I'm going to die," she decided at last, despair settling into her heart. Water splashed her face. Kentucky spluttered in shock, licking her lips and opening her eyes. She gasped at Sil's upside-down grin and let out a cry of fear, elation, and relief. "Half-wit, did you really think I wasn't coming back?" The snatch shuffled past more memories of fear, relief, fear, relief. The rhythm of Kentucky's younger self, as familiar to her as the pattern of her own breathing. And all the while she muttered and moaned, speaking, reliving, weeping, shrieking, and swaying to and fro. She wished for an end to it all. But she knew, as confidently as she could predict the rising and setting of the moon, that it would never end. She had set out to find the ending, and there was never any ending to find. It was only an unkind amusement of the fates, the winds, the changeless tides. There, a glimpse of solace. She clung to it defiantly, splashing back against the rapids. The creature's sunken face was terrible to look upon, disfigured by time and toil, battle and bruise, leathery ears tattered by long cold winters and one eye clouded with age and decay, but Kentucky was not afraid of him. He, the oldest of the V clan. He who had endured. She rested her chin on his nobini, his tunic of kelp and beads and loose fibers of braided hemp dancing about them both in the current, listening as he wove together colorful strands of long-ago times with his song, strands of great battles won and lost, the sundering of a mountain stronghold, and her favorite golden thread which she begged for him to sing, again and again and again. The heartspun magic of mankind. Forgotten tales of a kingdom under a mountain with two heads. A power which could banish the gnawing pain in the pit of her stomach. The elder did not speak to her as if she were a child, he listened to her sighs without reproach, and he sang softly to her. In return, she whistled the tunes she had learned from the birds to balm his aching joints. She wondered if this was what a father was. Had her father ever woven pretty songs for Syl? Jealousy and sorrow knotted together for a moment before the elder combed away her grief, gnarled claws trailing through her tangled hair as he murmured strange and savage tales of an age long past, abandoned by all but the one who endured. Before time and memory spun on, and the elder vanished from them, as if his frail gentleness had been wrenched from her arms anew, pouring through her grasping fingers like dry sand, and another face appeared. Kentucky clenched her fists and gritted her jaw, struggling in silence. But the wild shapes, colors, scents, and songs were flying by faster now, and the impetus pulled her along like an errant tide. "I see you, there," laughed the man, lodging his axe in a nearby stump and brushing off his hands. "You can come out, now, little bird. My name is Bren." "What is your name? Are you lost?" But Kentucky could not come out, she had never been spoken to by any such mortal, and she found his focus strangely upsetting. When he glimpsed her otherness, he would be afraid, and run. And then she would never taste his song, nor sup the blood of his veins, nor that of any mortal man. And Syl would mock her, and the elders would banish her forever from their rituals. She must not become one of the Cyanic, the eternal unworthy. Bren's eyes found hers in the bushes. He went very still, and for a moment, it was Kentucky herself who suddenly wished to run. Instead, she sang to him of sleep, and he fell as if dead upon the mossy ground. Syl need not know she was a coward, that she had not looked him in the waking eye when she soothed of his song. But as she put out a hand, her claws pricking the skin of his neck, she hesitated. Clandestine meetings by moonlight, the slow and methodical unraveling of a man, the sting of failure, hot soup, bitter herbs, Kentucky retched. Fleeing from her sister's wrath, flashing faster now, first glimpse of a mountain she had never seen, hardly hoped for, a stubborn door covered in runes she could not understand, now a little wooden nest in the woods, clever woven nets with fish aplenty, a pretty stone gleaming in the sunlight on a rotting wooden step. They had almost come to, it had almost come to, no, must not remember. Memories scattered with a mist, and a chill force lifted from her along with a weight she had not known was there. Kentucky knelt on the floor, gasping for air, her hands still pressed to the sides of her head. Hollow panic touched her heart, for her mind was empty and her ears rang loudly, as if a bell had been tolled, but one by one the stolen memories trickled back and her chest ached as the heart wounds ran afresh, such that she wished for the emptiness again. The misty threads still danced around her body, lingering in certain mundane places she did not think worth lingering upon, her hands, her arms, and whispering across the folds of the dress. When it had finished its unsettling exploration, the snatch drew back with a grumbling hum. Inky darkness blotted her skin and clothing wherever the tendrils had touched her. She stared at herself, whimpering. The viscous liquid dripped from her shaking fingers to the cold stone floor. "I see you. Now." It released a whistling breath which almost sounded sad, or, she suspected, possessed a semblance of sadness, whether feigned frill or molded such to simplify the complexity of its feelings for her less ancient mind. "Grrrhmmm," it muttered, and the fellfire eyes appeared behind their shroud of darkness. "I should not have been so hasty." Her heart leapt within her. She held fast. "You must have it. You cannot leave without it. After all you have endured, what suffering shall dissuade you now? Here at the edge of your despair, I will be giving you," she coughed, pressing her fingers to her throat. "Whatever you desire." It drifted closer with a low moan. "Whatever I desire. If I am possessing of it, and you wish for it, then it is yours, even my life and breath, only, you must be weaving this soul to mine first," she said quickly. "Else we have no trade." The eyes blinked at her. Perhaps she had caught it by surprise. "You would trade your breath for this boon?" Kentucky's throat constricted. to die was solitude and silence. Ember would be lost to you forever. But Ember was not the reason she had come. He was here only to avail her eternal suffering. She had sought this from the beginning, an end to the ravenous hunger, and whether by man magic or the magic of this dark entity mattered very little so long as she was sated in the end. Nonetheless, her eyes burned, and she found it difficult to speak the words. "You truly know nothing of hunger," whispered Kentucky, "if you believe it is a long life which I seek. Still, perhaps you should content yourself with immortality, as I do." It creaked, another laugh bubbling under its airy voice. "Your hands are empty, your riven soul worthless. And there is but one desire which remains to the one who remains." "Name it," she panted, edging closer, a groveling, slavering wretch. In that moment, Kentucky understood that she despised herself. She had always been unworthy, even now, she knew it was the enduring elder who deserved the sustenance he had sent her in pursuit of. It was only that she had never acknowledged it before. A not memory flashed through the stirred-up silt of Kentucky's mind, and she had suddenly, in her reckless fancies, impaled herself upon the pretty sword. At least she could finally surrender herself to its runic summons. What sort of end might that be? Perhaps there would be a moment of shining, shimmering ecstasy. A moment of frantic relief, before she breathed her last, "No, that will hurt too much, too soon." She bowed her head in shame, and her stained wrists rolled limply upon the floor, fingers twitching. Drool dripped down the front of her dress. Diminished, and wholly uncaring that she had been diminished. For what pride was left to be rent from her, now? All bravery she had once thought to own. It must have been vanity. No, she could never bring such a death upon her own self, and sweet Ember was not here to witness her treachery. He would end her misery with one fell strike if he knew of the words she had spoken. But she was far too cowardly. Too cowardly. And too close. "Name it," she repeated, "and it shall be yours." "Bring me another soul for my hoard," sighed the snatch, "and I will SSSSSE if I may grant your request." "You will see." Kentucky licked the drool from her lips, hissing. "I must be having of it. What good to me is a possibility? You promised my people, once, long ago, are you powerful enough to do this thing, or no?" If the snatch failed to amend her emptiness, and yet she walked away from this place with a soul for her own, then all would not be lost. Surely she could shape it, bend it, or break it, until it fit the empty place she loathed. GRRMMM. The nut eyes appeared again. Such a thing. It has not been done before. It is possible, in the realm of the unknown, as it was possible when your ancestors made me a pact. I do not squander my arts. Fetch me another soul to sup, and you may or may not receive SSSSSSOME reward for your efforts. If you cannot make me a vow, neither shall you get one, Kentucky spat, shoving away all thought of Ember's gentle, honest eyes. A soul for a soul. And you must be binding it directly to my heart. The snatch exhaled, lofting loose strands of hair around Kentucky's forehead. She choked on the fetid stench. "Bring me an unspoiled mortal, darkling riven, and I promise I shall try. We both hunger, you and I we know, we understand. Their warmth, their light, it calls to us, as it has ever called to us from the founding of the world." Kentucky rose unsteadily to her feet, wondering at the tremendous age of this entity. "Then you will be doing this for me? Mistake not amusement for ignorance. I have nothing to lose, and you, it would seem, have everything to attain." Before she could speak again, it added, "Keep these words in your heart, my sweet darkling. What other could render you SSSSSUCH sacred rites?" The mist dispersed. None other. A whispering wind touched the back of her neck, and was gone. Kentucky turned toward the door, half expecting to see a wisp of darkness slam it shut, but it appeared that she was free to depart. When she glanced over her shoulder, the room was dark and quiet as before, and the echoes had hushed. Not even a hint of mist swirled above the stone tiles. She scurried into the hall, struck by a creeping dread as wintry coldness shuddered through her bones. For the first time since leaving her ocean nest, Kentucky wrapped her arms around herself and wished that she were warmer. There was no need to tell Ember all that had transpired. Not yet. It would needlessly frighten him, for she did not intend to see her end of this bargain through. Only to trick the Snatch into restoring a piece of magic which ought to have been hers, by rights. She no longer felt she deserved it, but perhaps she never had. And anyway, it had been unjustly wrested from her ancestors, long before his people's kingdom fell. Surely even Ember could see the reason in that, if he knew all the truths that she knew. And yet you will not tell him. Her thoughts flitted frantically to and fro, and she bit her tongue to silence them all. What is a truth if it cannot be told? No understanding, no telling, muttered Kentucky under her breath, scurrying down the hall. He will not understand. If he could understand, of course she would tell him. Yet who else but another siren, or an entity such as the Snatch, could ever comprehend her misery? Such reckless words would only chase him away before she had decided what must be done. Yet even pondering such possibilities as those which now lay before only wrought a deeper misery. As she tracked her recent footsteps, the mist rose up thicker than she remembered from her first journey. At times she could hardly see through the greenish fog, finding her way by scent alone. The day that I first glimpsed him, working alone on the river path, we were both of us undone. Kentucky dug her claws into the woolen dress, pricking at her ribs until they bled. The fool and the coward. Snail skin. Ember knew that Kentucky remembered something of his nightly landscape, even though she denied being able to see into his dreams. After all, it was she who spun those very dreams for him each time he lay his head to sleep. Her touch always brought a spark of life back to the ashen landscape of the forest. He glimpsed her presence in those things which he had never seen before. Colorful flowers which swayed to her song, strange birds with shimmering feathers calling out to him from the trees, and the ashy bowls themselves had once appeared to take on craggy features which seemed almost human. But tonight there was no trace of the Sirena. Dead flowers bowed beneath crystalline ice, and the river was frozen over, its babbling voice eerily silent. He glanced up into the skeletal trees, where Kentucky's half-seen form sometimes crouched amidst a blooming bower of leaves, but the branches were cold and dead. He could not hear her singing, nor even the echoes of a song. "I don't suppose you passed out drunk and forgot to sing for me?" he muttered, shivering a little in the deadness of the forest. Not for the first time, he wondered why it was here that he found himself each night, in these nameless dreaming woods, and why he now felt lost where he had always felt most at home. The forests of the valley had always provided him sustenance when he needed it. Not bountifully, to be sure, but who was he to demand any measure of abundance? He was only a fisherman's son. Ember glanced down. In his fingers, loosely curled, there rested a glowing stone. The resin from the tree. "Where is Kentucky?" he inquired, as if it could talk back. The stone did not reply. He lifted it and peered through its swirling amber surface, as if the makeshift lens could guide him back to his capricious companion. As he studied the honey-tinted trees, a wisp of a figure flashed within their midst. Ember cried out and dropped the stone, darting up the slope. "Hullo! Wait!" he shouted, with a desperation which escaped his understanding. "Who are you?" Surely not the wicked sister come to plague him again, for she would never have run from him. Crackling leaves rushed around his ankles, skittering away from his frantic scrambling, but by the time he reached the top of the crest, the figure had vanished. His sight puffed into a swirling cloud of vapor that wisped across the forested landscape, and for a moment he thought he glimpsed that pale figure standing not far away upon the rise, but it was only his own breath. He wrapped his arms around himself and glanced about, shivering bleakly. "Am I alone?" The words slipped from him without realizing, and the forest stirred around him in reply, frost creeping over the branches and ice cracking in the distance. He had been alone all his life. Why was that thought so bothersome to him, now? Had he changed so much? Had she changed him so much? A gossamer radiance drifted amidst the barren trees below, like a flicker of a campfire, and he wondered if he had glimpsed one of the orbs from the sister's footstool, but as he crunched through the crackling leaves and dead flowers, he noticed that it was more intricate than a simple sphere of light. This entity was somehow both a tongue of golden flame and the figure of a man. Ember swallowed hard, and decided the best course of action was to announce his presence with a smile, if he could summon one. "Hello," he called again, and lifted his hand. His heart pounded as the distant figure proffered a hand in reply, the greeting he had hoped for, yet hardly expected in this strange unreality. And so he descended the slope. As he did, another wisp of flame appeared behind the first. And then one appeared to his left amidst the scraggly underbrush. And then another, far off upon the frozen river. The first appeared in the likeness of a man, and then a woman, and then another woman, and then a child. There were many, and soon they surrounded him. But by the time he reached the bottom of the slope, and the figure who continued to offer his ghostly hand, he had lost all apprehension. "Why are you here?" he whispered, though what he really wished to know was if Kentucky had sent them there, or if he had dreamt them in his present loneliness, but he could not deny the wild and reckless impulse their presence drummed up within his heart. It was strangely alluring, and he wondered what would happen if he accepted the invitation. So he did. But as Ember put forth his hand, ice crackled the branches above and a damp gray mist swept through the frosted detritus, bringing with it a foulness. The odor of rotting corpses, musty mildew, and burning oil assailed his senses, and he instinctively glanced back for the comforting stone light he had dropped. He saw a faint glow beneath the leaves not far away. Before he could take a single step in that direction, its light diminished and was gone, snuffed out beneath the drifting shadow which had stolen over the woods. Something was coming. Something older than the wind, and older than the trees. The gray mist descended, and a primal fear swept through him. He unthinkingly reached out to grasp the proffered hand of the spectral figure, and as he did, a tremendous pressure of undiluted sound blasted forth. 1,000 thoughts and faces rushed into his mind, each one tumbling away again to make way for the next before he could grasp onto anything familiar. There were only disconnected memories and 1,000 tortured voices screaming, crying, wailing, and dying. As each voice crashed through his mind, for a fraction of a moment, he possessed the power to destroy with a single word, to heal with a single touch, and sensed the tempestuous pull of 1,000 threads of possibility so real he could taste them on his tongue, feel them coursing through his veins, glimpse the fabric of reality which ebbed and flowed around them. Memories of tangible magic writhed beyond his reach. Eons of esoteric knowledge. And eternity of despair. And as the mist enveloped them all, Ember felt his own voice leaving his body, his unheard scream echoing through an abyss of endless agony with all the rest of the nameless horde of men. No light spilled onto the cobblestone floor. Kentucky was certain she had left the door propped open, and the tree stones should be shining faintly from this distance. Her steps slowed as she approached, and she listened for Ember's familiar presence. It was inaudible above the soft whisperings of the rock and gentle stirrings of the air. Perhaps the very aged wine had dulled her senses, or hushed his song somehow. Had she come to the wrong door? No, it was slightly ajar, just as she had left it. Kentucky pushed the door open with a creak and a wooden groan, and peered inside. There was just enough light for her to see by, and the place where he had rested by the barrels was empty. She hesitated, frightened of some trickery, and then glanced over her shoulder. "Ember?" she whispered, stepping into the room. The leather pack lay on the floor beside the empty wine bottles, and as she crept closer she saw the hilt of the pretty sword beneath it. He must be nearby, for he would not have gone far without his weapon. Red fermented berry juice pooled on the floor, staining the tiles. Kentucky knelt beside the pack and trailed her fingers across the hewn rock. His scent lingered, and the stone was faintly warm. Then her claws ticked against something like glass, and she seized upon it. The tree stone, dark as a coal, its song diminished. Kentucky cupped it to her lips and blew on the polished surface, rubbing some life and warmth back into the resin before rising to her feet. She gave the room another cursory glance, this time in the newly kindled light. Wooden barrels and stone pillars and quiet emptiness. No man. "He will not have gone far," said Kentucky to herself. But her steps quickened as she flung open the oaken door and strode out into the hall again, peering first one way and then the other. A faint mist yet hung above the cobbles, but none of it, save the path she had trod, had been recently disturbed. She re-entered the room, casting the stone light into every shadow, certain she had missed something. All was still and quiet. Battling a rising wave of panic, Kentucky sprinted back out into the hall, staring down the misty corridor the way she had come. Her lip trembled, but she opened her mouth and softly called him by name. Ember. She waited, listening to the pleasant echoes roll across the stone. They tumbled into silence. Ember? She cried again, taking 2 steps forward and pricking her ears. She held her breath, watching, waiting. If he was there, he would surely come to the sound of her voice, as he had always come, as he would always come. He is coming. He is coming. But he did not come. Kentucky took 3 deep breaths, and then shrieked his name aloud, her voice breaking beneath the strength of her summons. Dust rained from the ceiling above and pattered in distant corridors, and the stone trembled underfoot, pebbles bouncing. Ember. The halls resounded 1,000 times over, calling the precious name back to her, and the combined power of the siren echoes would have been enough to bring the whole of the human clan he had forsaken running to her side. She waited still. Breathless, hopeful. Silence. A low wail pressed against her throat and prickling panic overwhelmed her reason. She dropped to the stone, her eye falling upon a gleaming hilt. The pretty sword. Kentucky yanked Ember's weapon out from under the pack, the blade tugging loose of the leather, and her eyes were instantly drawn to the shining metal. A few clear strains of music shivered through the air, shifting like moonlight on fractured ice as she tilted the mortal blade. The surface shimmered. She reached for the etched runes. Ah! Kentucky stuffed a burned finger into her mouth, an unpleasant memory awakening. Whistling a sharp note to clear her mind, she sprang to her feet. The sword was heavier than it appeared, and began to shake in her hands, as if trying to loose itself of her grasp. Magic rippled across the blade, betraying the subtle spells imbued within the metal as human runes glowed menacingly in the dim light. No! She cried out in frustration, smacking it against one of the barrels and splintering the ancient oak. We must go to Ember. The sword buzzed peevishly as Kentucky clamped her fingers around the hilt, glancing upward to avoid the tempting shine. She stood fast for a moment, panting in indecision, and then snatched up the leather belt. But even then, even as she knew she must seek Ember at once, the pretty sword remained aloft before her. Her mind slowed. Kentucky stared, the cords in her wrist taut with effort. At last, with a huffing breath, she quietly hid away the enchanting runes. The small yet wholly transfixing rays of blue light vanished one after the other as the etchings were consumed by the sturdy leather shell. With an inhuman quickness to accommodate for her lapse, she strapped the belt around her waist, though not without some difficulty. It was meant for a larger frame, but she tied off the ends in a few quick movements and snugged it between her shoulders. Though she found it clumsy, the rebellious weapon had been subdued, and Ember's salty sweat clung to the leather. A scent she found comforting. Rising swiftly, Kentucky tucked the tree stone into the bosom of her dress and scampered into the hall, whispering little curses and comforts to herself. Green mist devoured her tracks, and the disembodied voices which had once lured her into the darkness were now strangely muffled, but her own musk left a lingering trail. Find Ember. Snailskin Part 2. The sword was unwieldy and the belt bit into the healing sores about her neck, but she traversed the cobblestone road in leaps and bounds, pausing only to catch a drifting scent or remember which path she had taken. When at last she approached the final turn, silence hung over the dark corridor. Snuffling quietly, Kentucky lowered herself toward the floor and crept along the wall, feeling the cracked stone with her fingertips. The souls yet sang behind it. She could sense their presence, taste their scintillating energy. When she rounded the corner, the great door stood agape. The pretty sword shivered against her spine as Kentucky burrowed her claws into the rock-hewn floor. Bluish light spilled into the corridor, illuminating a few curling tendrils of mist, and a soft, strained breath echoed from the cavernous room. Grrrhhmmm. Kentucky forsook the safety of the shadows, sprinted the last few strides, and sprang through the door on silent feet. The snatch roiled above her, a cloud of misery far larger and blacker than she remembered, and before the storm of darkness, arms stretched out against the wall and head thrown back in a silent cry, Ember. His toes hovered above the floor, heels pressed into the wall, teeth clenched. His hands formed shaking fists. Pale tear trails tracked through the dust and grime, and his tunic clung to his body, drenched and dripping sweat. Black words scraped from the swaying mist with dreadful resonance. Fouler than any mortal tongue, more bewitching than any siren song. The snatch fondled Ember's face, and fresh tears spilled from both eyes as his tongue moved soundlessly against a slackening jaw. Glimmers of light pulsed beneath the surface of his skin, trickling through the veins of his arms and the cords of his neck and gathering above his heart. Branching fingers entwined with luminous strands of soul, an unholy merging of darkness and light. Faltering footsteps carried her across the floor, toward his heavy heartbeat. Slow, dull, labored. Like a drowning man. The muffled thumping filled her ears. The song pressed against her skin. Her mouth opened. Her riven soul trembled. The exhaled essence of all mankind swirled before her. She had but to put out her hand, and claim it for her own. And then the mist withered away, wrenching the perfect magic from his chest with fibrous talons. Threads of light between shadow and man pulled taut, and Ember's body convulsed. The scream that tore his throat was not a scream of mortal men, but a hoarse cry ripped from the lungs of a wild thing. The howl of a mortal creature sundered from thought and will, no longer even the master of its own voice. Dark blood trickled from both nostrils and dripped into his gaping mouth. Ember's blue eyes rolled wide. Kentucky yanked frantically at the sword hilt, but her arms were shorter than Ember's and for a heart-stopping moment it would not shake loose of the leather. With a shivering hum, it wept free. Icy runes blazed to life. She slashed the blade through the mass of writhing shadows, shrieking furiously. The demon split in half, wisps of smoke wafting away, but swiftly rejoined as if it had never been severed. Again she struck true, and again the smoke gathered into itself. Chanting the darkest, oldest, deadliest curses known to the sons and daughters of Clan Vlee, Kentucky battered the twisting apparition with sword and claw, each stroke wilder and ever more desperate, pretty sword blazing like a torch in the night. The short blade cleaved through mist where a neck, a head, a gut most certainly ought to be, yet the snatch never slowed and no innards spilled forth. It was a spirit being, no more of the mortal world than the sorrowed souls which sustained it. When her last weary stroke nicked the wall above Ember's shoulder, Kentucky stopped short, the tip of the blade clinking against the stone floor. Remnants of Sel's cruel laughter echoed from a distant past. Half-wit. She could no more harm the snatch than one could silence the wind in the trees or keep a wave upon the rocks. It was an unassailable force, and it, like the earth itself, would blow and billow whither it wished regardless of her doings. Ember's scream cracked into a gasping wheeze. Only a few scant threads remained, the swirling weave of magic swallowed by the mist. The perverse chanting of the snatch pried at her wits, feasted upon the vestiges of her sanity. This entity had never intended to keep its promise, and now it had taken her Ember. Head eddying with the clamor of disembodied voices, Kentucky dropped the sword and wailed. It impacted the stone with a resounding clang. She stumbled forward. Weeping songs swirled from the shadows. Ethereal, beckoning. Her swift movements brushed the mist aside, and four jars appeared at her feet. Kentucky limply retrieved one of them, smoothing her fingers over the glass and casting a glance at the soul snatch. Its back was to her, its attention fixed upon Ember. The blinding brilliance of his song was too bright for Kentucky's siren eyes. She squinted down at the jar in her hands. The wretched soul within whispered frantically, jumbling human words and siren words and ancient words of shadow, and a desperate loneliness consumed her. And through the whispers, a familiar phrase. Snail skin. Her heart shuddered. And she cast the jar upon the ground. Crystalline shards scattered in every direction, pelting Kentucky's bare ankles and skipping across the stone. The freed soul flared to life. A blinding burst of pure white light so magnificent that Kentucky cried out in pain and surprise, and then leaped up, leaving a trail of sparkling dust before vanishing into the ether. The snatch hushed, its smoky wraith form twisting in the air. Wicked eyes of fire snapped from its writhing human prey to the sirena it had too quickly dismissed, who now stood in the ruins of a glass prison. It reshaped its murky essence to match the new position of the eyes and observed her, still and quiet. Ember gagged, head bowed, straining in anguished silence. Drops of sweat rolled down his temples. And a low, throaty creak guttered the room. Kentucky bared her fangs at the snatch and whisked another jar from the shelf. The fire eyes flared darkly. "Rivensssoul." It whistled, unleashing a gust of breath that sent her dark hair whirling. Kentucky dipped her fingers into her bosom and took hold of the tree stone, folding it into her sticky palm and concealing its faint glow within the woolen skirt. She raised the jar. With a sound like a muffled thunderclap, infinite strings of blackness snapped away from Ember's body and the great light of his soul thudded back into his chest, the space around him rippling. He sucked in a ragged gasp and collapsed to the stone, residual light flickering through his veins. Wide blue eyes stared sightlessly past her, body limp as death, not even a shallow breath lifted his ribs. Ember. Glass exploded across the stone. Screeching like a wounded owl, the snatch lashed out with spindly arms. Kentucky danced away and swept up 2 more jars, one after the other. 2 more souls flashed amid the scattered shards, squealing to life, and disappeared into the forbidden beyond. The snatch shook and spluttered as each vessel was destroyed, and Kentucky dared neither to take her eyes off her quarry nor pause her retreat as it approached, freeing the precious lights as she moved, dashing them from the wooden shelves or kicking them into one another. It was a torment, but a torment with rhythm. Rhythm was music, patterns, and light. It sheltered her fragile sanity. With every soul which flew beyond their grasp, the shadow shriveled. Grasping fingers reached from the mist, and the back of her foot pressed into the stony wall. She could retreat no further. As the vile being bent its blazing wrath upon her, Kentucky cupped the tree stone in both hands, bringing it to her lips. She whispered softly to it, thanking it fondly for the many days it had accompanied them both, kindling its golden light, and shouted the oldest siren word for breaking. Deep cracks split the ceiling and shattered rock fell like rain. Kentucky cast the resin down. Crack. Fragments of tree blood sprayed across the room with a sound of tinkling glass, and liquid sunlight burst from the resin, seeping between the cobbled stones. The snatch released a furious roar which rattled the remaining jars. A gust of wind swept out from its presence. Kentucky curled away from the source, and even Ember's still form listed beneath the gale strength of it. When at last it died to a breathless creak, she had fully retreated into a dusty corner, her exposed skin dry and blistered. It burbled and shrank, wisps of smoke fluttering about like the wings of a drowning raven. The whistling cries sank to a raspy whisper. Each time it swelled, gathering itself for an assault. The light of the sticky sap flashed vengefully and the snatch diminished with a desolate sigh. The stone yet remembered the tree from whence it came. Kentucky darted through the shards of glass and sprinted past both shadow and stone. It guttered an incantation, but the grasping fingers brushed her ankles without harm. Ember. Kentucky sang, her voice fraying as she crouched beside him. Ember, Ember. Quickly rolling him onto his back, she bent low, listening for the hum of his soul. Yes, he lived. But when she held a finger under his nose, no warmth of breath stirred. His skin was pale, damp, and chilled, eyes sunken and staring with the stare of the abyss. Chapter 54. The Sea, the Mist, and the Moon. Kentucky pressed her hands to either side of his face, invoking restoration, life and vigor. It was not until she wandered into the simple arrangement which had most often turned his head and curled his lips into a smile, the melody first taught to the youngest of her clan, and that which she had hummed upon his doorstep what seemed so many moons ago, that Ember's pulse fluttered beneath his skin, thrilling her fingertips. His sightless eyes flickered. She leaned close, her mouth brushing the tip of his nose. Awake. He blinked. Kentucky, she flinched, but he seized the leather belt across her shoulders and yanked, heaving in a ragged breath. Kentucky's mouth popped open as his shaking fingers found her arm. Darkness misted the space between them, throwing up a barrier, a fog of twisted shame, and she thought to push him away, to protect him from her own folly. But he pulled her in with such urgency that Kentucky could not refuse. The closeness was exhilarating, and more terrible than ever. It seeped from his skin, his mouth, with every breath. The vibrant song which had lain quietly beneath his breast, undisturbed for so many years, had been stirred up like sand in a summer storm. He brushed his shaking thumb across her cheek and let out a strangled sob. "You came." Kentucky averted her eyes. The relief, the wonderment, that was not for her. It was for a fantasy of his own making, a loving, selfless illusion whom Kentucky had eagerly fashioned with her songs and friendly banter. Such a creature did not exist. She never had. Kentucky murmured soft apologies, wiping tear trails from his face and leaving sticky slime behind. He grew warmer beneath her fingertips, heartbeat fluttering to life. Yet even now his jaw hung slack, as if the air he breathed were not enough to sustain him. When she slipped her arms beneath his shoulders to pull him upright, a chorus of scents greeted her, some pungent and others very faint: berry juice, honey, damp cloth, salty blood, and bitter fear sweat. He sat quietly for a moment while she muttered and fussed with his garments, hoping to quell his shivers. All her efforts were for naught. At last she accepted failure, tugging him gently to his feet. He was heavy, and all the heavier after her recent struggle. "You came for us," he wheezed, very softly. Kentucky shifted, draping his arm around her shoulders. She would not look at him. She could not look at him. "Can hear them," he choked. He kept one heavy arm around Kentucky, but held out his other hand as if he could touch the lights from across the room. "There, we're in pain." Ember shuffled toward the chorus of souls, and the smoky darkness swirled viciously around the shattered stone. A few black words snarled through the room and he fell back into her arms with a wounded cry. Kentucky soothed him, but the soul voices swelled and rose to drown her out. He struggled to free himself from her embrace. The shadow had weakened him and she trudged toward the door, desperate to get him away from those beautiful lights. They could not have her Ember. 1,000 years, dust, dust and ashes, breath and life, he sobbed, sagging toward the floor. Breath and life. Ember. Kentucky stopped just short of the corridor with a weary gasp, hauling Ember by one sweat-soaked arm, yet he continued to babble on in a mad fervor, such that she wondered if the snatch had broken his mind. Rage seared her senses, swiftly followed by regret so profound that she nearly collapsed beneath the combined weight of her guilt and his unwieldy frame. "So dark," he moaned against her, chest heaving, eyes tightly shut. "It's so dark. So dark. We begged for death, all of us, and no one came. How can you leave us here? How can you abandon us? Snailskin?" Kentucky flinched. Hearing those words leave Ember's tongue stung worse than a slap to the face. When he opened his eyes, they were bleak and bloodshot, and blazing with a golden light so fierce that Kentucky shrieked in horror, and nearly dropped him altogether. He seemed not to notice, sliding further down into her arms. Tears dripped quietly from his chin, and a low groan slipped from his open mouth. Shivering, Kentucky glanced over her shoulder. The songs flickered more brightly beneath her stare, a silent challenge. "Release us," Ember intoned, and without the smothering weight of the mist suppressing their lost voices, 100 souls whispered together. "Release." Her scarred feet carried her across the floor, one step at a time. Half against her will. Past muttering shadow, past glowing shards of stone, and through a sea of shattered glass. The nearest of the lights blinked eagerly at her, flashing sunset hues of pink and gold. She tenderly lifted the small jar, held it above her head, flung it to the cobblestones. 1,000 glittering pieces scattered, and a jubilant soul flashed into the ether. What followed, Kentucky thought should kill her, and, indeed, it nearly drove her mad. For she was forced to repeat these actions, again, and again, and again. Each time she hesitated, she glimpsed Ember's crumpled form, and dashed the glass prison to pieces, until at last, the final flame flickered before her. Green like the sea, sparkling beneath the summer's sun. She cradled it for a moment, entranced. It was a delicate bottle, and like the others, imbued with dark enchantments the essence of which she could not untangle, for they were of neither man nor siren kind. It rested very prettily in her hands, round at the bottom with a tapered neck. A raised filigree embellished the foggy glass, in the shape of a flower she did not know. The light wavered as a soft, effeminate song crooned to her heart. Oceans of desire washed over her then. She sank. Down, down, down. Her fingers clamped around it and she drew the bottle to her nose, breathing softly. A faint gasp tugged her attention from the trapped soul to Ember. He knelt in the shadows, his lips blue and his skin ashen. Dirt and tears streaked his face as he braced himself against the floor with one hand. "Traitor!" hushed the voices in Ember all as one. Kentucky flinched, her grasp loosening. The glass shattered. Dregs of ancient rose oil wafted upward, the forgotten scent misting her feet. One more soul flashed to life, swirling twice around Kentucky before twinkling out of existence. The room went dark, lit only by the smoldering glow of the broken tree stone. And all the tension drained from Ember's tarred silhouette. Fear of bringing him to further harm was the only restraint that kept Kentucky from screaming until her throat bled, and her ears heard no more, and her voice cracked into 1,000 irreparable pieces like Neil-enchanted glass. Instead, she lifted her chin, wrung her hands, and passed quietly through the broken remains, treading lightly on the tips of her toes to avoid cutting her feet, though the distraction of pain might have been a small mercy. Ember grasped her gently when she drew near, and though his touch tormented her, Kentucky returned it. Together, they half crawled and half stumbled free from the ruined hoard. Without the misery of men to feed its strength, the snatch had shrunk to the size of a large rat, its watery form so condensed that it appeared as a fragment of black night sky against the liquid sunshine. Panting, Kentucky dropped Ember's arm and grasped the iron-bound oak. It resisted at first, creaking and grinding, but she finally managed to swing the heavy door shut with a hollow boom, and a sense of profound relief fell over her. She stood before the door for a moment, wondering how she might secure it. When nothing occurred to her, she tugged Ember forward and helped him totter down the hall. They made it only 20 shambling paces before he collapsed, and Kentucky was too spent to help him up again. It would have to suffice until the morrow. Ember opened his eyes as the mist of a nightmare faded. The remnants of shared knowledge and clamoring voices spilled through his fingers like water, and he found he had retained none of them. Though he had a distinct impression that he had been speaking with someone else, perhaps many someones all at once. They had vanished along with the forest of his dreams. Or had it been real? Or, worst of all, this was a dream, and he would awaken to the innumerable grasping fingers and boundless abyss, if he but let his weary mind slip back into the pit of banished memories. A soft shape moved beside him, leaning over the blankets. 2 dark eyes peered down at him, and all fear faded as the scent of river crocuses and trod-upon moss swept aside the ghastly specters. More recent recollections of padding footsteps, something soft being tucked beneath his head, and a familiar voice entreating him to drink from a flask wafted back to him, dismissing the remainder of his nightmare. "I'm safe. I'm safe. I'm safe." But his breath quickened, and his heart did not believe it, for it pounded against his ribs with such force that the blankets twitched in rhythm. What was that?" he wheezed, his voice cracking. "That demon?" "I do not know," Kentucky mused, gazing down at her hands. Her quietude both calmed him and unsettled him. She wove her slender fingers together as she spoke. "Perhaps it is a demon, if that is what your people are calling it, or perhaps it is something else entirely. Are you real?" He fumbled, interrupting her. Her black eyes darted over him, flitting away again just as quickly, and he wasn't sure how to interpret the brief glance. He swallowed twice, and curled his fingers more tightly around the blankets. Every fiber of his body ached and he felt astonishingly fragile, as if he had been torn apart and patched back together with hardly a care. A darkness pressed against his mind, threatening to unravel him once again if he ventured too close. "At first, I thought I was trapped in a dream, that thing, when it took me, but knew it had to be real. I've never felt a pain like that in all my days." Kentucky's shoulders slumped, and trembled. It did something to me, Kentucky." The words tumbled from his lips, faster and faster, and he clenched the blanket until his knuckles turned white. "It pulled something out of me, my breath, my life, I don't know. I was floating outside of myself, or worse, I was myself, but... ugh. Like an empty mattress on washing day. Like a child's doll, with the straw and bits of cloth all pulled out of it. Ember could not stop himself. The impression consumed him, and suddenly all he wanted was for Kentucky to understand. For somebody, anybody, to take his hand and reassure him that he wasn't a madman, that this journey through the Mountain Kingdom was nothing but a soon-to-be-forgotten nightmare, and that all would be well again. That he would be whole again. Tears streamed down his face, but he hardly noticed them, caught up in the throes of his own garbled confession. I felt so weak, so useless, so unraveled. Do you know what it's like, to see yourself, outside of yourself? He knew he wasn't making sense, but he no longer cared. I could have devoured the moon and all the stars, and even that would not have put things to rights. So empty. It hurt so awfully bad, Kentucky. I'm ashamed of myself. But, if I could have killed myself, I would have. But I knew you wouldn't leave me there. I knew you would follow. And I knew it would be all right in the end, when you came. A sob racked his aching ribs, and Ember pressed a hand to his throat. A black pit yawned before him, as desolate and real as the void he had confronted in the clutches of the shadow beast. What is to become of me, Kentucky? Kentucky? He needed to hear her voice. He wanted her to make these terrors disappear. But she remained silent. Kentucky, he whispered, fumbling for her hand. I had nothing. I was nothing. It's so unspeakably terrible. To be empty. He couldn't see. He couldn't breathe, and then a broken trill pierced the shadow before him, and the mist wafted away to reveal Kentucky's pale face. Tendrils of black hair clung to her sticky forehead, and she grasped his wrist with her clammy fingers. The scent of crushed flower petals washed away the stench of death, and the look on her face struck him cold. Shock, sorrow, a bone-chilling desire. I know. 2 words. They carried a dreadful weight. How do you live with it, the emptiness, I mean? He whispered, more tears running down his face and soaking into the pillow. How can you keep going? Would weep with every breath. He wearily dragged an arm across his eyes. The darkness had relinquished him, but its grip had not left him unmarked. Little things, his own heart softly beating inside his chest, the way the tears tasted when he opened his mouth, the scratchy blankets on his skin, now seemed all-important and all-consuming, and he was overwrought by their significance. Kentucky must have understood, at least in part, for after several moments passed he heard her voice again. Sirens have no tears, she crooned, along with hell sigh gusting over his face. The sea, the mist, and the moon part 2. Her breath was damp and fragrant, like a verdant spring evening after a rainfall. Or the mist that sometimes crept up the river, which you often fancy it came from the ocean itself. The Sirena's fathomless gaze flickered over him again, black eyes deep and full of secrets. If he asked her endless questions and she did nothing but answer them all for 100 days and nights, he felt he would never reach the bottom of that well. He tried to hold those eyes with his, another question resting on the tip of his tongue, but all thought faded before his newfound clarity. After staring into the shadow of death what seemed but a moment ago, and living to remember it, all prior fears were inconsequential. Suppose they never reached the other door. Suppose he never again felt the touch of sunlight or the warmth of a harvest breeze? They were so close to the end of his road, but anything could happen between this moment and the next. The voices of 1,000 souls echoed in his mind, and he realized how very, very short his life was, how small he was, in the great scheme of the world. Suddenly, he knew exactly what he wanted. And, for the first time in his life, he was bold enough to seek it out, and see if it may be found. Ember lifted himself up on one elbow and gently pulled a strand of hair from Kentucky's slimy cheek, looping it behind her ear. She blinked, eyes widening. Her fragrant breath chilled his lips and nose as he leaned forward, trembling with an uncertain mixture of fear and excitement. A moment before their mouths met, she twitched and he bumped his nose on her chin instead. She sat up very suddenly, her eyes rounding further. Ember reached for her hand. She yanked it away from him and recoiled, brushing her fingers on the skirt. Her tongue fluttered out, anxiously dampening each corner of her mouth. Heat rushed to his face and the tips of his ears. Her discomfort was clear, yet after all that he had done her reluctance stung like a slap to the face. What hurt him most was the acute understanding that he would do it all over again. For even the quietest word of approval, the most fleeting touch, or nothing but to be in her presence a few moments more. "Kentucky," he mumbled, humiliation washing over him, "I just wanted to thank you for—" "No thanks will be necessary," she said swiftly, darting a glance at the ceiling. "I am only being for you what you're always being. For me." Ember watched her in silence, trying to make some sense of her words. Then he ventured, "Have I done something to offend you?" "No," hissed the Sirena, with enough force to make him flinch. "You have done nothing." He finally ducked his head, the blush creeping over his entire face and down his neck. Straightening her skirts, Kentucky hummed a few brisk notes that he thought were meant to put an end to it, but his heart was beating too fast and his thoughts whirling too confusedly for her simple melodies to silence him. Was she frightened? Timid? No, not timid, not Kentucky. Not ever. What, then? Had he made a fool of himself? Had she misunderstood his clumsy attentions, his oft-misspoken compliments? Surely she must know her very scent bewitches me. He blushed anew at a few of the recent memories which beset him. How could he have fancied himself desirable, much less the equal of such a powerful creature? Yet she herself had wronged him, had even owned to her wrongdoing. Not all of it, to be sure, but some of it. Was it even possible that she thought herself beneath him? He dismissed that notion out of hand, and his eyes began to smart all over again. "Ember, you fool! Have I not earned some portion of your trust?" he murmured, trying and failing to keep an edge of desperation from betraying his dignity. "You have mine, if you wish for it." She turned slightly, as if pulled by his voice, but continued to stare at the wall behind him. "When I thought I was to die, all I could think about was you." "I?" A fresh flush warmed his cheeks. "I know what a fool I must seem to you, but—" "Maker's breath, you don't even know how lovely you are." He expected her to agree with his sentiments, perhaps even to correct him with some recognition of her own beauty. Flattery had always been the way to Kentucky's heart in the past, but now she did not smile. A muscle below her eye shivered and she swallowed hard, her aspect strangely hollow. "You are weary, Ember. Sleep." But Ember sat up straighter, the blankets falling into his lap, and tried to catch her eye again. "Believe me when I say I have no delusions. I know I'm hardly worthy of a passing glance, even in my valley. But, what are you knowing of wild magic?" The question was so sudden, her voice so unexpectedly lively, that it rendered him speechless. He blinked, his heart fluttering in surprise. "Kentucky, you, Ember," she said lowly. The cords in her neck stiffened and the strain upon her face was frightening in its clarity. He eased himself back to the stone floor, nestling his head into the crook of his arm. "I will discuss anything you wish. Anything else, at all." Stunned, he attempted to gather his thoughts, but they had scattered like leaves in a harvest wind. The Sirena relented, placing her hand near to his upon the blankets. His heart pounded even at that slight acknowledgment. "What do you know of wild magic?" she repeated, gentling her tone. "What tales are told in your valley?" "Very few," Ember confessed, absently reaching for her hand. She twitched her slender fingers away and exhaled again. "There is not so much wild magic in the world now as there was when my ancestors were born. The lights in the woods are a lingering presence from days long past, and, I think, the tree. But many such things have come and gone, and will not come again." Ember knew she was only attempting to dissuade him, but he did wonder why she had chosen such a topic. Perhaps it had been foremost among her thoughts, of late. He reluctantly decided to indulge her, if only to distract from his own embarrassment. "What of the—" He shuddered, and all the heat drained out of him. Teeth chattering, he pulled the blankets up over his torso again. "The demon?" Kentucky tensed, and then sighed. "I do not know. I do not wish to think upon it further." Have you encountered any other wild magic? He murmured, curious in spite of himself. Her glance was keen, and her eyes flashed. Yes. He moved his fingers toward hers again, and again she evaded him. Of what sort? I am of the wild magic, Ember. He froze, his fingertips very near to her. She pulled away, grasping a fistful of her skirt and curling her claws into the fabric. Her other hand she loosely curled against her chest, and for the first time he let his gaze freely wander the curves beneath her dress. After all, he thought, even if I am to have nothing else of her regard, she is still very beautiful. She may refuse to look at me, but why shouldn't I look at her? I've already gone and made the greatest fool of myself. There's no need to hide my own regard. How do you mean? My people are great shapers, she sang gently. We shape ourselves. Long ago, the first of the sirens are made of three things: sea spray, morning mist, and moonlight. He shivered, remembering the oracle's scrolls, if ever it was known that knowledge hath by and lost, and more pity upon us. They are named the Crusade by the devout. Before he could inquire further, Kentucky shifted onto her knees and hummed a few notes. Their temerity surprised him, and it took her several moments to find her tune. Now shall I be singing you to sleep? He reflected upon her discretion. She always asked him first, no matter how often he said yes. After you tell me more about your people, he bartered, resentful. How can you have shaped yourselves? Her eyes darted all around, and she shifted again, settling down on the stones. We are not the only beings shaped by magic. I am seeing, and she held up the appropriate number of fingers as she spoke, a wolf with eyes that shine like the moon, a mountain pool reflecting a starry sky in the light of day, a huddle of trees that creak and sway even when there is no wind. Yes, but how do they become such things? He watched her carefully. Everything is made by something, nothing makes itself. A short silence ensued. The magic shapes them, if they dwell in the wildest parts of the woods too long, she murmured, after a short time. Then, more softly, or they are made thus by their own doings. Her words settled upon him with a chill. Rest softly, Ember, for there is nothing else which I may gift to you. He thought of an unseen moon aglow in the twilight hours, a fine morning mist upon the path to the riverbank, and the frothing waves of an ocean he had only glimpsed in the eyes of his wandering mind. Chapter 55. Dust into Dust. The woods were grim, each tree adorned with ice and all flowers turned to frost. They stood tall amidst the fog of his dream, skeletal branches reaching for the darkening sky, where hung a moonless dusk and a scattering of stars. A forbidding landscape, broken and haunted by the remnants of what might have been. Kentucky's lullaby echoed long among the lonely pines, fainter than before, and beneath that fair voice there lay a heavier, discordant melody which bent it and smothered it, swaying to and fro like a reed in the wind. Ember breathed into his hands to warm them as the blood fled his fingers. From behind him drifted a sumptuous summons. Your heart is bruised. He froze, feet sinking into the freshly fallen snow. The siren melodies twined higher and higher, sister voices, though one was now nearly overwhelmed by the other. But those words, that drifting breath, was an impossibility. No more than a cruel trick of his own mind. He forced himself to be calm, awaiting Kentucky's spell song to sweep it away, for the figment of fear to fade. Instead, her layered accompaniment became ever more distant, merely an echo of its usual chorus. A darker thrumming arose to take full possession of his senses, commanding him to turn. He obeyed, glancing back. The naked witch stood mere paces from his shoulder, her gaze aglow, shivering skin scintillating in the misty darkness, eyes fluttering and rolling back in her head in a manner which altogether abandoned any attempt at a human mask. Ember recoiled, crunching backward across the carpet of frozen leaves and putting out a hand to steady himself against the tree. You can't be here, he stammered. I smell it, hissed Sil, the light in her eyes shining through him. I taste it. He fell still, captured in that light, that ravenous flicker. Held fast by her stirring breath. SOMETHING has crushed the song of your bones. Her eyelids twitched and her chest heaved beneath the mane of waterfall red, a once sultry song now breathless and ragged, and somehow he loved it the better, and hated himself the more. Once, Syl of Clanville was blind. She wanted only to crack open your ribs, and consume me whole. But now that I am seeing what is possible, what a waste that would be. Black claws flashed in the fading light and bloodless fingers seized him by the neck, again. The last wafting echoes of Kentucky's lullaby were choked out of his mind as Syl's mouth pulled wide. She tightened her grip. Her eyes were perfectly round and dark, smile flat and toothy, batwing ears trembling in anticipation. He grabbed her damp wrists, unable to utter so much as a gasp. "Shh," purred Syl. "There is no fight left in you, Ember of the Oracles. If Kentucky had but silenced her troublesome tongue when first we met in the woods below this mountain, you would be crawling at my feet already. Yes, I am sure I would have been knowing. Yet, in time." The sinews tensed within her arms, belying a physical strength which rivaled that of any mortal man. Ember giggled, tears streaming from both eyes and blurring her tangled hair into a smear of blood. A faint memory calmed his sense of panic, the soft rushing of 1,000 voices whispering through these barren pines. He winced at the slimy skin which slipped beneath his fingers and scrabbled against her palms, gouging his own neck. The chattering grew louder, urging him, beckoning him into the afterlight of a radiant history. He recalled a few of those ancient faces now, and their pool of fathomless knowledge. It was almost within his reach, or at least, he felt it was. The power to rend and remake the fabric of reality. "My sister cannot save you," she trilled, relishing the taste of the words upon her tongue. "In the end, it is always her fate to lead Syl of Clanville to the pitiful fools whom she adores, the way a child favors its pet. Your soul is mine now, for I have cast her out, and she will never have you again." Ember shut his eyes, forcing his locked fingers to release their grip on her arms, and punched Syl in the face. Something cracked beneath his knuckles, and she shrieked, loosening her grasp. He wrenched free and ran without looking to see what he had struck, staggering wildly up the hill, snatching and grabbing at the roots and low-hanging branches of the trees. Darkness had taken hold, and the stars vanished. The landscape sank into an even colder winter. Somewhere behind him there chanted a fell voice, invoking words of darkness. A gust of bitter wind lashed his hair into his face, and the top layer of snow swirled around his ankles, whipping up into a blinding frenzy. He had to get out of this valley. Get out of this waking dream. Kentucky carefully tucked the blanket around Ember's neck and shoulders, and brushed a sticky curl of hair from his forehead. An unfamiliar longing overcame her, and for that fleeting instant, she entertained the forbidden fancy of what it might be like to grant him the kiss he had sought. She tucked her arms together and wilted into the stony floor. He was only enamored of her musk and siren charms. She could not keep him warm, for she had no warmth unto herself, no living blood to sing with his. The moon and the sun could never touch, only admire one another from afar. She was of the ocean spray, and he was of the dust, and to dust he was bound. Until he returned to such a state, he would always be a slave to her brokenness, her emptiness, if indeed he truly cared for her at all. Ember was not her Ember. He had never been, nor would he ever be. Kentucky's fist clenched, wishing for the tree stone, but its comforting glow was forever lost. Her hungry eyes strayed to the only remaining source of illumination, a finger's breadth of metal which peered out from its leather cocoon, a single rune glowing bluer than the sea, and a prettiness which tangled her thoughts like a fly in spider silk. She hesitated, wrapped her claws around the hilt, slowly drew the pretty sword from its shell. The full set of otherworldly human etchings rippled like the light of a summer moon, reflecting on her pale arms in a watery dance. Beautiful and dangerous. Two notions which all too often could be found clasped in a fatal embrace. It was these very notions which she and all her kinfolk must always embody in the eyes of mortal men, lest they come to ruin. As Ember would come to ruin, if indeed he had not. Kively is a wretched thing, who brings her friends to harm, she whispered, compelled by the guilt which smoldered beneath her breast. It was a slow poison, relentless in its conquest, but the soft words eased her discomfort. Though, in the end, always, She is sorry for it. The sword shimmered beneath her breath. Kentucky swallowed a lump of fear, reaching for the blade. The arts of those enchantments were as dead as Ember's ancestors, but the metal seemed not quite alive, humming a simple song of its own. Not unlike the phantom woman who haunted her wandering footsteps in every darkened hall. Silly little fish. Yet she had no creature to confide in, none other soul, riven nor whole, to share in her immortal sorrows. I wish to keep him safe, you see. In this, at least, are we not of one heart? As she spoke, she lowered her hand. The blade buzzed, glowing fiercely, and spun itself in a slow circle over the cobblestone. Closer, ever closer, until her finger hovered near to touching. It lodged against a crack in the road and hummed quietly in place, hilt rattling against her knee. A muffled whimper escaped her as she contemplated those beautiful runes. Had she not defied the snatch with this sword in her hands? Was it not rightfully hers, at least in part? The sword grew warm below her fingers. It must revel in her anguish. The burbling laughter of the snatch lingered in her ears, the shame so fresh in her mind, her loss so deep, that the slight from such a little thing was more than she could bear. I am what I am, Kentucky cried in the siren tongue. I cannot unmake myself. Ember groaned and stirred in his sleep. She cast a frantic glance in his direction, whispering something half-remembered and half-contrived to ease his restless dreams. The blankets shifted, and he sighed. Her attention flew back to the pretty sword. A ripple of silvery light had just reached the point of the blade, and the runes went dark. She observed it for several minutes in silence. Then she tapped it with a claw. It shivered, but no light flashed along the metal. Kentucky pressed her finger to the runes. It was cold beneath her touch. Unfriendly, perhaps. No grew a bite. Letting out a breath in a rush of disbelief, Kentucky trailed the human runes with the pad of her finger. Then she pulled the naked sword into her lap, following the pattern of the etchings over and over and pretending she could read them. It was a thing she had wished to do many times, and even now she found some solace in it. As she touched the cool engravings, her thoughts stilled and cooled like the metal ridges, hardening into a crystalline pattern of beauty and chaos. If she had any emotion to spare for reminiscing, it might have prompted memories of the way ice crept over ponds or lakes in the winter, deep, and dark, and cold beneath, but clear and tranquil on the surface. Into the wildwood they marched, she sighed, where magic makes its den, and sank onto the ocean deep to dwell apart from men. The sword shivered beneath her fingers, and Kentucky closed her eyes. A strange, chill solace enveloped her mind. The wildwood, will have their hearts again. Kentucky awoke to a faint buzz resonating through the stone beneath her. She drifted away from the void of sleep and sat up, rubbing her eyes. The dull dark of grief and weariness was cast away by a blurry glow on the floor, near to her Ember lay sleeping. The pretty sword spun in slow circles, buzzing and shaking with righteous fury. It pulsed, like a faint heartbeat. Kentucky watched in silent confusion, and then held a hand above it. A song of wrath shivered the air. It only trembled thusly when it knew her voice, and when it knew the voice of the lonely one whom Ember had sent into the greater darkness. Kentucky frowned, glancing about the dim hall, but they were alone. Nor could she hear the song of another siren. She hesitantly touched the runes with her finger, but they were still on good terms, and it pained her not. She grabbed the haft, lifting the blade from the stone, and pointed it down the hall, away from Ember. It quieted. As she lofted it toward his nest of blankets, the buzzing grew more angry. She eyed him as he slept, and noticed that his lidded gaze wandered to and fro. He was still lost in the dream she had spun him. "It is only Ember," she whispered, unsettled. "What means you by this?" The sword stilled as she moved it away, and shook again, glowing more fiercely, as she swung it back toward Ember. She opened her mouth to inquire once more, but before she could speak, Ember let out a grumbling sigh and shifted on the stone. His hand reached out from under the blankets, and his fingers grasped at nothing. They twitched, as if searching for something to grab onto, and his head jerked to the side as if trying to sit up. "Ember?" Kentucky murmured, regret blossoming deep in her chest like a wretched flower. "He is having a bad dream." But how can this be? Perhaps our song is weaker than before. Dismayed by this thought, Kentucky grasped his elbow and shook him faintly. Ember, wake up now, please. You're dreaming. He twitched more erratically, and his mouth fell open in a panting breath. Ember, awake. His fingers grasped again, and he blocked something unseen with his elbow, knocking her hand away. Low vibrations emanated from his chest, and for a fleeting instant the fragrance of his swirling soul swallowed her senses whole. The glow appeared to spread from the sword to Ember, radiance suffusing his features in a beatific glow. She had no time to be confused by this, as his mumbling became muttered words. Kentucky leaned as close as she dared, drool pooling beneath her tongue, but could not understand them. They were too slurred, and spoken between clenched teeth. She fashioned a soothing hum, a few notes which had always brought him peace. Sounds of warmth and comfort. Ember's head wrenched back, slamming against the floor, and he let out an anguished cry, like a man who had been struck in the back. Kentucky shrieked and grabbed his arm, shaking him roughly. Ember, wake. Wake. The sword spun near her ankles. She swept it aloft. It thrummed with a vengeance, and when she moved it toward his head, it flashed brightly. Yarg. Kentucky dropped the sword, which clanged against the floor, and snatched Ember's face in both her hands, almost an instinct, driven by desperation. Her skin prickled, the hair on the back of her neck lifting as she touched his fevered brow. Above the overwhelmingly pungent scent of his essence, she caught a faint hint of crushed pine and sage. Her hands trembled. Sister. Ember grabbed her arms. Kentucky reflexively jerked away, cowed by the smell of her past, but he held her fast. His grip was strong, frantic, and his mumbled nonsense quickened, as if he were muttering an incantation. It wasn't the pretty sword which cast a light upon his face. His skin was aglow. The blood beneath coursed with a luminosity which suffused his lips, his cheeks, winding down his neck in golden strands. His eyes twitched sightlessly, forehead furrowed, and he gripped her arms so tightly she thought he would crush them. The scent drifted from his mouth. A sirena's breath. She gasped, and clamped her fingers against his temples. Then she opened her mouth and shouted a simple command. Sight. The air around her shivered, fishbutter rattled against the floor, and her vision dimmed. Ember's grip tightened, and Kentucky dug her claws into his skull, shutting her eyes. The breath was sucked out of her lungs, and for a moment, she felt as if she were dying. Then a white light glowed at the edges of her vision. Gasping, Kentucky groped for Ember, but her fingers scraped dry earth. He was gone. And she was cold. Kentucky glanced up as colors sprawled across her sight. A starless sky, engulfed by the skeletal arms of a barren wood. Told continued. Thanks for listening.